There's a chill in the air as the early morning sun pierces through the light fog hugging the Vltava River. Like ghosts, ships with the heads of dragons slip quietly through the waters. One of the most famous Vikings to ever live, Ragnar Lothbrok, silently leads an army of 10,000 bloodthirsty Vikings, originally bound for the rivers of England. Unknown to him, however, is the fact that he has sailed not just through fog, but also through space and time. For a brief encounter, history unfolded brings the Vikings to an enemy they never met in our time. Separated by 400 years, the Vikings are about to clash with a group of righteous revolutionaries ready to lay down their lives for their families, beliefs, and their freedom. This is History Unfolded, Vikings versus Hussites. As the Vikings make landfall, nothing seems amiss. The fertile plains along the banks of the river seem quite similar to the Thames they were originally aiming for. But, unbeknownst to them, instead of London, they're about to attack Prague, the capital of Bohemia, now known as the Czech Republic. As the Vikings land, the fog obscures something crucial: a fortress on a hill known as Vyšehrad, garrisoned by a fighting force 4,000 strong that made even emperors think twice about attacking. The Vikings have no way of knowing this though, and ready themselves to pillage and plunder what they think is London. They move swiftly across the plains leading to Prague, but just before they reach the city, the strangest sight greets them. There, in front of the city, are circles made of hundreds of wagons and what looks like a few thousand troops. These are the infamous Hussites and their war wagons, known as Wagenburg, led by their greatest tactician, Jan Žižka, the man who resisted the Crusades and the Holy Roman Empire in 1420 and emerged victorious. Both armies face each other, both ready for a fight. Who will win? To answer that, you'll need to wait just a second to see the outcome, as we not only need to see what both armies are packing, but we also need to check if you've liked the video and subscribed yet. We want to keep these kinds of videos coming, and you can help us do just that. So please smash them if you can, and ring the bell for more. On with the show. To start, let's take a look at the armies, beginning with the Vikings. The Viking Heer is 10,000 men strong, led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. His men are high on morale and perhaps even some other substances, ready to pillage and plunder. The Vikings aren't all outfitted the same. Your average income Viking would have leather armor, axes, and wooden shields with metal rims. Poor warriors didn't wear much armor and carried spears or sea axes, a fighting knife around 12 to 20 inches long. Wealthy warriors would wear chainmail armor, carry swords and battle axes, and use metal shields of high quality. As most warriors weren't wealthy, we can assume that most of the warriors would be of average and poor class, with the minority being of the wealthy class. Let's not forget that among these warriors would be the legendary wolfcoats and berserkers, elite Viking warriors whose ferocity and battle frenzies were the stuff of legend and incredibly demoralizing to most foes who faced them. On the other side of the field, we have the Hussites, 4,000 men strong and surrounded by their mobile fortifications with wood and metal plates for protection. Their weaponry is innovative even for its time. Firstly, the mass use of handheld cannons or handgunner. The precursor to the gun was a staple for the wagons alongside crossbows. They also used slightly larger cannons called tarasnice as mobile field artillery. As for the more numerous infantry, they held pikes, halberds, swords, and adapted farming equipment called shekan, with spikes planted inside of them for use against people. They also fielded light cavalry for small charges. The Hussites of this era fought off crusaders in defense of their beliefs, and they were exceptional at it. Speaking of defense, while the Hussites themselves rarely wear more than leather armor, they do employ shields with wedges in their design. The pavis shield, designed to counter enemy arrows and deflect sword blows more effectively than normal straight shields. It's time to return to our opposing armies, and while these two armies never faced each other in real life, we'll be putting them up against each other, using each nation's known battle tactics to create as realistic a scenario as possible. Firstly, we must acknowledge the Vikings have no reference point when facing the Hussite defenses. Ragnar needs to pillage the city though, since the Vikings are low on resources from their trip and his men are eager to fight, but the enemy before them is unlike anything he's ever encountered. Ragnar would be confused, but not reckless enough to simply charge head on. Being a brilliant strategist, he would wait and try to poke and prod the enemy to gauge how they work, what their defenses are, and whether or not he should commit to the battle, or wait for another opportunity. On the other side of the field, the Hussites have just recently led a successful campaign to drive out the Holy Roman Empire from their lands. They are expecting another fight, and their morale is high. They're ready to fight a defensive battle, and with Jan Žižka leading them, they have yet to taste defeat. The Hussites believe they're fighting an enemy they must defeat at all costs and will attempt to maximize their advantages, like, for instance, using the fog for cover. The Hussites know their land extremely well, and historically they use that knowledge against their enemies with deadly efficiency. This puts Ragnar at a disadvantage, and while he assesses the situation to try and come up with an effective strategy, the Hussites make the first move. Hundreds of horses would shoot out from the fog along the Vikings' flank and charge into the unsuspecting Vikings, leading to hundreds of deaths and many more injuries. The psychological effect of a cavalry charge is not to be underestimated, and this would shake some of the Vikings who didn't expect such an attack so quickly. As quickly as they came, the horses retreat in the direction of the wagons. Jan Žižka is a master tactician himself. He knows that if he can provoke his enemy into pursuing him, he will have the advantage on the defensive front. Ragnar isn't given much time to strategize. His enemy has made their move, and he'll have to make decisions on the fly if he doesn't want to take more losses. He knows the longer he waits, the more likely the cavalry will return and tire out his men. While he's wary of the wagon circles, it's clear that he has the numerical advantage. 10,000 Vikings are no small force, and the enemy in front of him only numbers in the low thousands. This is when he would dispatch a few thousand of his lightly armed forces to form shield walls and encircle the wagons, sending his archers in support to rain arrows on the waiting enemies, keeping his stronger forces in reserve. Jan Žižka on the Hussite side wouldn't know who these strange disheveled warriors were, but it wouldn't change the fact that the defense of his home is his priority. Seeing the enemy infantry moving, Jan sees the cavalry charge has done its job, luring the enemy into battle. Jan and the wagons wait for them to get in close. They're heavily outnumbered by the Vikings, but it doesn't matter. Just like the Americans, hundreds of years in the future, the Hussites have discovered the multiplying power of combined arms tactics. These wagons were the battle tanks of their day, and as the Vikings near the Wagenburg, the shock and surprise of gunpowder would shatter their morale. To the Vikings, it would be like claps and booms of thunder ringing out as smoke rises from the wagons. This is an encounter no amount of ferocity can prepare you for. The Vikings would falter as the tight lines of shield walls fall, crossbow bolts and small cannons fire through gaps in the wagons, and hand cannons flash as projectiles tear into the Vikings. The noise is unlike anything the Vikings have faced before, and in just a few volleys, hundreds would lie dead. These Vikings are of the poorer class, and with their morale this low, and encountering a fearsome enemy for the first time, one could expect the majority of them to turn tail and run. This is when the gunfire would stop, and the hundreds of Hussite horses would dash out to cut down the Vikings in retreat. Before Ragnar knows it, he's almost suffered the loss of nearly 1,000 men in the span of a few minutes. The Vikings aren't pushovers, however, and Ragnar knows that he either lets more of his men die on the run, or he rallies them and commits his entire force to negate the horses. He gathers his troops with spearmen at the front in a shield wall formation to counter the horsemen. Ragnar has his defenses in place, but he has no counter for the Hussite guns. Unsure whether to press the attack or retreat, Ragnar decides to trust in his numerical superiority and speed, employing his classic feigned attack to draw the enemy out of their defensive formation. He'll attack them with a wall of troops. Then, when the enemy commits, he'll allow the enemy to pursue his forces, feigning a retreat. However, this is where he'll allow the center of his forces to buckle, but get the flanks to encircle the enemy. Then, before they know it, there will be no escape for them. Ragnar knows that Viking specialties are close combat and shock tactics, and he needs to sacrifice a few lives if he wants to win this battle. Jan Žižka of the Hussites know that they are outnumbered, but these are odds that the Hussites are used to. He also knows that superior numbers also give an enemy a sense of security, and that can be exploited. As the Vikings line up and begin their march, he signals for the wagons to disperse and enter an arrow formation. The Hussites are now setting the bait for their trap. Ragnar sees the defenses of the wagons break up. It seems as though the enemy is disbanding their defensive location and choosing to face the Vikings head-on. This is an ideal opportunity for the Vikings to get in close while the Hussite fortifications are disrupted. He needs to seize this opportunity. He sounds the charge and the plan to encircle the Hussites begins. Gunfire echoes around the Vikings, but instead of mass casualties, the Vikings find themselves only being pelted with crossbow bolts. A danger to be sure, though nowhere near as deadly if you're shielded. It seems the mystery weapons of these foes have let them down. It's time for Ragnar to commit his elites, the berserkers and wolfcoats, to maximize their close combat effectiveness. The Hussites, it seems, didn't expect their plan to fail and begin to retreat, setting their wagons to turn around and flee. This is their chance. The Vikings finally close with their enemies and unleash their most ferocious warriors on the Hussites. Berserkers flail madly with axes, catching the Hussites by surprise with their ferocity, while Hussite pikemen and halberdiers launch a flurry of attacks, desperate to throw the Vikings off. Ragnar is sure that this is the beginning of the end for his enemies, as his forces bunch the Hussites in and surround them. That's when Jan Žižka sounds the order to reform the Wagenburg. And far swifter than one could imagine possible, the Wagenburg relinks its formation. The trap is sprung. Hundreds of sharp retorts and heavy booms ring out, gunfire ripping apart the attacking Vikings in a way they've never seen before. Ragnar realizes too late that he's been lured into a trap. Numerical superiority is neutralized when facing fortifications, and the Hussites just moved theirs to lure the Vikings into a trap. With the majority of the Vikings committed, they have no choice but to try and overwhelm the Hussites with numbers. But when you can't even reach your enemy, and guns, pikes and halberds are continuously attacking you from relative safety, it isn't looking good for Ragnar. This defense is unlike any he's ever encountered. Ragnar realizes he needs to retreat and calls for the forces to pull back. He won't endanger any more lives unnecessarily. He needs to regroup and consider a different tactic. He wasn't aware that these wagons would wield such power. But before he can put any more plans into motion, that is when all hell breaks loose. More gunfire rains down upon Ragnar himself and the remaining Viking forces from behind. The Hussites have moved under the cover of the fog from their fortress and are now pelting the Vikings. Before he knows it, Ragnar is on the defense. He rallies the Vikings to retreat to their ships. There's no time to strategize, and he needs to prioritize the lives of his men and minimize his losses. The Vikings are swift, though horses and bullets are faster. The Hussite light cavalry joins the fray and causes chaos in the ranks, running down the retreating Vikings. The Vikings make it back to their ships once the Hussites disengage, and upon a head count, the damage to the Vikings is extraordinary. 3,000 men are lost in an engagement that scarcely lasted 20 minutes, with many more injured. They retreat into the fog to lick their wounds after their stinging defeat and wonder at the foes they just fought. The Hussites, meanwhile, aren't unscathed, having lost nearly 1,000 men to the Viking ferocity. Yet they sing resounding songs of victory as Jan Žižka leads them to yet another successful defense and victory for their home. They're a far cry from independence from Catholicism, but the seeds are sown and their legacy is just beginning. As we pull back and the smoke clears, the difference technology makes are stark. Ragnar may be a great strategist, but without a clear point of reference, he didn't have the information he needed to make the right decisions. Firearms and cannons didn't exist in his time, and discovering them on the battlefield is a shocking blow to morale that isn't easily remedied. The Vikings also excel in raiding, not protracted fights, and even with such a large army, the Vikings aren't very disciplined and focus rather on individual combat, not combined tactics, a weakness that the Hussites could easily exploit. Speaking of the Hussites, their tactics were revolutionary even in their time. The Crusaders they faced had no idea how to counter them, and the Hussites' use of gunpowder and handheld early guns was brand new. No tactics or counters worked against them in the beginning, allowing them to eventually drive out the Holy Roman Empire and establish the Czech identity we know and love today. It's clear then that had Ragnar known what he was facing, he likely would have changed tactics or not attacked in the first place. The Hussites used their knowledge of the terrain, their war wagons, and their combined arms tactics to great effect, making them nigh untouchable warriors in their time. Their tactics were just as shell-shocking to the Crusaders as the arrival of the tank was to World War I soldiers. Comment down below what you thought of the battle, and if you might have tried some different tactics. Do you think Ragnar and the Vikings would have fared better at night? We love hearing from you, and if you have a famous civilization or historical figure you'd like to see in our Versus video, let us know, and we will make it happen. And that's a wrap on our Versus video. Did you enjoy seeing this kind of hypothetical battle? If you did, we have many more just like that one waiting for you. Also, can you believe that someone would try to sell the Eiffel Tower in a scam twice? We sure couldn't. Here's a link to that as well. If you made it this far, please give a like, subscribe for more, and hit that bell so you don't miss out. As always, stay curious.